Elijah Carter stood at the altar, preaching about redemption, unaware that his real name, Marcus Reed, was finally catching up to him through the blood of his own mother, cousin, and ex-wife. In the quiet town of Brookhollow, Elijah Carter was a man of honor, faith, and influence. He stood tall every Sunday at the pulpit of New Mercy Chapel, delivering sermons that made people weep and repent. His voice was smooth and convincing, his eyes full of understanding, and his presence comforting. Everyone knew him as the pastor who gave second chances, especially to those society had written off. The church grew under his leadership, and so did his reputation. People traveled from neighboring towns just to hear him speak. He performed baptisms, weddings, funerals, and charity events. He was the embodiment of virtue, but nothing about Elijah Carter was real. Behind the tailored suits in Scripture was a man who had spent his entire adult life running from who he used to be. Elijah Carter was actually Marcus Reed, a name erased from the system more than 20 years ago. Marcus had grown up in a different world, one where poverty, crime, and chaos were normal. Arrested at 17 for identity fraud and petty theft, Marcus had learned how to manipulate systems early on. He used different aliases, forged documents, and even managed to disappear from law enforcement radar after his release. By the time he turned 25, Marcus had created a new identity from scratch. He moved to a different state, joined a small church, and started presenting himself as a man reformed by faith. Slowly, Marcus became Elijah. Over the years, he studied the Bible obsessively, learning its verses and stories not out of devotion but necessity. People believed in redemption, and he knew how to sell it. His charisma drew people in. The original pastor of the small church he joined eventually retired, and Elijah, as he was now known, took over. The congregation exploded in size. Donations poured in. He married a local woman, built a beautiful home, and started mentoring troubled youth. It was the perfect cover. No one asked questions. No one looked too closely. To them, Elijah Carter had always existed, but the illusion came at a cost. Marcus knew there were people who remembered who he really was. His past wasn't buried as deep as he pretended. His mother, Lorraine Reed, was still alive and had watched her son vanish and reappear under a different name. She had kept quiet for years, believing he might truly have changed. But time brought guilt, and guilt made her speak. A voicemail she left for a lawyer hinted that she was ready to expose him. She didn't know it yet, but those few seconds of audio would seal her fate. Marcus also had a cousin, Damien, who had once served time with him in juvenile detention. Damien had stumbled across a video of Pastor Elijah Carter preaching on television and recognized him immediately. At first, he laughed. Then he realized the power Marcus now held. Damien didn't want justice. He wanted control. He began threatening to go public, knowing it could destroy Elijah's empire. And then there was Alana, Marcus's ex-wife from his early 20s. She had witnessed his darker side before he reinvented himself. They had split when she uncovered one of his cons. She had moved on, but when she saw Elijah's photo in a church newsletter online, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Elijah Carter had built his entire life on a lie. And as those who knew the truth started to circle closer, his desperation grew. The man people admired as a spiritual leader wasn't thinking about grace or forgiveness. He was thinking about survival. And for Marcus Reed, survival had always come at someone else's expense. The first death came quietly, almost unnoticed by the world. Lorraine Reed, a 71-year-old woman living alone in a modest home in rural Georgia, was found dead in her recliner by a neighbor who hadn't seen her in several days. The scene was peaceful. A cup of tea rested on a side table, untouched. The television was still on, casting flickering light across the living room. The coroner ruled a Natural death, a stroke, most likely brought on by age and stress. No autopsy was ordered. No suspicions were raised. She was buried in a small cemetery 2 towns over with only a few distant relatives in attendance. No one at the time knew that 2 weeks before her death, Lorraine had placed a call to an attorney in Brook Hollow. Her message was brief but strange. She claimed to have information about a man named Elijah Carter, someone she insisted was not who he claimed to be. Her voice was shaky, hesitant, but she was clear. She believed her son Marcus was pretending to be someone else and had become a public figure. She didn't say more and didn't follow up. The voicemail was lost in a backlog of unanswered messages and forgotten until months later. But it was enough to suggest that Lorraine had grown uneasy, that guilt or fear had finally pushed her to speak up. Lorraine had carried the secret for over 20 years. She had helped Marcus disappear after his release from juvenile detention, even driving him across state lines to start over. At the time, she thought she was giving her son a chance at a better life. But she watched from a distance as he changed his name and cut all ties. Eventually, he stopped calling altogether. Still, she remained silent. Maybe she believed that if he was truly helping others, the past didn't matter anymore. But as news of Elijah Carter's growing fame reached her, that silence began to feel heavy. Something didn't sit right. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was fear. But whatever it was, it pushed her to pick up the phone. She didn't get a second chance to explain. The timing of her death was too convenient. Yet no one made the connection. Elijah didn't attend her funeral. He hadn't spoken publicly about his mother in years. In fact, few people in Brook Hollow even knew he had living relatives. He told his congregation that he had grown up an orphan, bouncing from foster homes to group homes, finding faith on his own. It was a story that moved people. It made his success seem even more miraculous. And it was a lie. The truth was that Lorraine's death had been planned. Elijah had known about the voicemail. He'd been monitoring her for months through an old contact who kept tabs on her. When he learned she had spoken to a lawyer, he acted fast. Lorraine had become a risk he couldn't afford. Her death was made to look like fate, but it was anything but. She had been silenced before she could be heard, her attempt at redemption crushed beneath the weight of her son's secret. With Lorraine gone, Elijah felt a temporary sense of relief. One threat was gone, and no one suspected a thing. But that relief would be short-lived. Others still remembered Marcus Reed. And while Elijah had been able to hide behind the mask of a holy man for years, the cracks were beginning to show. The lie was unraveling, and the next person who remembered the truth wouldn't be so easy to stop. Damian Brooks had always been the kind of person who noticed what others missed. Growing up, he and Marcus Reed were more like brothers than cousins. They got into trouble together, did time together, and made promises in the back seats of police cars that neither of them kept. While Marcus had vanished into thin air after his release, Damian stayed in the system, bouncing from halfway houses to job training programs, never quite escaping the pull of his record. He thought Marcus was long gone, maybe even dead, until one afternoon when a friend showed him a video on social media. It was a clip from a church revival in Brook Hollow. The man on stage, clean-shaven and confident, wore a tailored suit and spoke like a man of God. But Damian recognized him instantly. That was Marcus. That was his cousin. And he was now a preacher. At first, Damian laughed. The idea was absurd. Marcus had been a liar, a hustler, a man who ran scams without blinking. He was not the kind of person who found religion. He was the kind who used it. But the laughter faded as the video continued. Marcus, now Elijah, was convincing. His congregation adored him. He spoke of second chances and redemption, of leaving the past behind. Damian couldn't believe what he was seeing. Marcus had done it. He had rewritten his entire life. And no one knew. Damian started digging. He found the church's website, newspaper articles, donation pages, and interviews. He read about how Elijah had helped build housing for the homeless and started programs for at-risk youth. But Damien knew the truth. He remembered the real Marcus, the one who manipulated people, who forged signatures, who once staged a car accident for an insurance payout. It made his skin crawl, and it made him angry. Not because Marcus had changed, but because he hadn't. He was just hiding better. Damien began posting cryptic messages online. He wrote vague warnings about fake preachers and criminals in disguise. He emailed reporters and contacted people who followed Elijah's ministry. Most ignored him. Others blocked him. A few told Elijah directly, and Elijah noticed. The name Damien Brooks was one he hadn't heard in years, but it was one he couldn't afford to ignore. Damien knew too much. He could connect dots that no one else could. He didn't have evidence yet, but he was getting closer every day. Elijah had silenced his mother, but Damien was louder, bolder, and reckless. Then Damien disappeared. His car was found on a desolate back road in another county, burned beyond recognition. At first, investigators believed it was an accident. The vehicle was old. The engine could have overheated. But when the body inside was identified and the autopsy completed, things didn't add up. Damien had suffered a massive head injury before the fire started. He hadn't crashed, he had been attacked. The fire was deliberate, meant to erase any trace of the truth. The case made the local news for a few days, then faded. Damien's criminal record made him an unlikely target for public sympathy. No one linked him to Elijah Carter. No one asked why he'd been trying so hard to expose a preacher from another state. Elijah didn't flinch. He gave a sermon that Sunday about storms in life and how faith could carry you through them. His congregation wept. Another threat was gone. But the fear didn't leave him. If Damien could find him, others could too. His ex-wife, Alana, was still out there, and she had seen more than anyone. She knew what Marcus was capable of. Elijah wasn't safe yet. Not while she was alive. Alana Rivers had tried for years to forget Marcus Reed. Their marriage had been short, turbulent, and filled with deception. She had met him when she was barely 20, drawn in by his charm and promises of a new beginning. At first, he seemed like the man she had always dreamed of, confident, ambitious, and full of ideas. But those ideas were rooted in fraud and manipulation. She discovered his lies one by one. The fake jobs, the stolen checks, the aliases he used when he thought no one was looking. When she confronted him, he vanished. Just like that, he disappeared from her life, leaving behind nothing but confusion and betrayal. She changed her last name, moved states, and tried to rebuild. Years passed. Alana became a social worker, dedicating her life to helping people escape cycles of abuse and exploitation, cycles she knew too well. She had buried her memories of Marcus under layers of responsibility and routine. But one afternoon, while waiting in line at a coffee shop, she saw a man's face on a charity poster taped to the wall. It was promoting a food drive led by Pastor Elijah Carter of New Mercy Chapel. Alana froze. The name meant nothing, but the face was unforgettable. It was Marcus, older, more refined, wearing a clerical collar, but still Marcus. She went home, shaken. At first, she doubted herself. Could it really be him? Could someone who lied, cheated, and disappeared now be preaching the gospel to hundreds? She couldn't ignore the feeling, so she started looking into him. The more she uncovered, the more convinced she became. Elijah Carter's background was spotless, almost too perfect. No childhood photos, no high school records, no family interviews. Just a man who seemed to appear out of nowhere with a story of redemption and a polished public image. It didn't add up. Alana contacted a retired detective who had once investigated Marcus for a string of fraud cases. He remembered the name, and he remembered Alana. Together, they began gathering documents, marriage records, old arrest reports, and digital traces. They began building a file that connected Marcus Reed to Elijah Carter. It was circumstantial, but it was enough to start a conversation with law enforcement. Alana believed she finally had the chance to stop him before someone else got hurt. But she never made it to the police point. 3 days before her scheduled meeting with an investigator, Alana disappeared. Her coworkers assumed she had taken time off. She had mentioned feeling tired and overwhelmed. But when she failed to return phone calls or respond to emails, concern began to grow. Her car was found abandoned near a hiking trail she had never visited before. Her phone was missing, and her apartment had been neatly arranged as if someone had wiped it clean. Her body was discovered in a river 5 miles outside town. At first glance, it looked like a drowning, maybe even suicide. But the autopsy told a different story. There were no water-filled lungs. Instead, her bloodstream contained a powerful sedative, one that left no odor and acted quickly. The report suggested she had been unconscious before entering the water. It was murder, but with no suspects and no clear motive. The investigation stalled that Alana's death never made the news outside her city. Her connection to Elijah Carter remained hidden. The file she was building disappeared with her. Her laptop, external drives, and paper notes were all gone. It was as if her pursuit of truth had been erased. Elijah, once again, maintained his calm. He held a televised prayer session for victims of violence that week, quoting scripture about justice and faith. His image remained intact, but behind closed doors, he was growing more cautious. Each threat had come closer than the last. The walls were closing in, and the mask he had worn for so long was beginning to slip. Elijah Carter believed he had covered every trail. His mother was gone, his cousin silenced, and his ex-wife erased before she could reach the authorities. With each death, he felt the risk diminish, the secret buried deeper. He continued to preach, to smile in front of cameras, to shake hands with the faithful and the powerful alike. The church expanded its outreach, began construction on a new youth center, and received a large government grant designed to support community leaders making an impact. That grant would be the beginning of his downfall. To process the funding, Elijah was required to undergo a standard background check. Normally, his fabricated identity held up against these screenings. Over the years, he had refined every detail: social security number, education history, even references from pastors in other towns who were long dead or unreachable. But this time, a low-level government employee flagged a minor inconsistency in one of his documents. It was small, a date on a birth certificate that didn't match records from the Social Security Administration. A red flag appeared in the system. Curious, the employee ran a fingerprint check on the application. It was a routine security measure, nothing unusual. But the prints, though altered slightly over the years, were still tied to a sealed juvenile record belonging to Marcus Reed. The file had been dormant for over 2 decades, never expunged, just forgotten. But now it was open again, and someone was asking questions. The investigation began quietly. Detectives reviewed the connections between Marcus and Elijah, tracing the paper trail backward. The more they found, the more disturbing the picture became. Marcus Reed had vanished at 22. Elijah Carter had appeared just 1 year later in a different state with no past and no verified background. The overlap was too precise to ignore. The authorities began connecting the deaths of Lorraine Reed, Damian Brooks, and Alana Rivers. Though each had been ruled inconclusive, suspicious, or accidental, all three had one thing in common. They were tied to Marcus. The old voicemail Lorraine left for the attorney was finally discovered, buried in the firm's digital archives. When investigators replayed it, her words rang with fear and urgency. She had known the truth and had been silenced before she could explain it. A similar pattern emerged in Damien's online activity and Alana's missing files. The evidence wasn't complete, but the coincidences were too strong to dismiss that a task force was quietly formed to build a case against Elijah. Undercover agents attended his church, took notes, studied his movements, even searched through church financial records for signs of coercion or cover-ups. Surveillance confirmed he had visited Georgia around the time of his mother's death, and out-of-state travel records placed him near Alana's home just days before she disappeared. Then came the arrest that happened on a sunny Sunday morning, right in the middle of service. Elijah stood at the altar, delivering a message about trust and faith. The sanctuary was full. Cameras rolled. Children sat quietly beside their parents. The doors burst open, and officers walked down the aisle. There was no struggle. Elijah didn't protest. He raised his hands and allowed the cuffs to close around his wrists. The congregation gasped, frozen in disbelief. News of his arrest spread like wildfire. His face was plastered across television screens, headlines reading, "Beloved pastor accused of triple murder." Members of his church were interviewed, shocked and heartbroken. Investigators revealed the truth gradually: the false identity, the suspicious deaths, the forged history. The man they worshipped had never existed. Elijah Carter, or rather Marcus Reed, was charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, obstruction of justice, and identity theft. As the trial approached, more details emerged, painting the portrait of a man who killed not out of anger or revenge, but out of fear of being exposed, of losing the life he stole. In the end, it wasn't justice that unraveled him. It was the past he had tried so desperately to erase.